Hi, everybody. So the topic for my presentation, which I chose today, is a brief European history of animal experiments. My name is Stephen van Swieten, and I would like to focus on prominent animal experiments, experimenters, and prominent views on animal experimenters throughout our history. So starting with the origins of animal experiments in a classic era, so going way back to the ancient Greek, as early as the 6th century before Christ, animal experiments were already performed. And throughout history, this is usually done by dissection and vivisection. So, in other words, the dissection of living creatures in animals. And the reasoning or justification, if you want to call it, for the animal experiments were that humans were closer to the mythological gods of the ancient Greek. So it was okay or allowed for humans to perform these animal experiments. One prominent animal experimenter of this era was Aristotle, actually. He was also a physiologist. And another prominent animal experimenter of the classic era a bit later was Claudius Galenus, who wrote hundreds of titles on physiology based on animal experiments, and his books had authority until the era of the Enlightenment, actually, because in the medieval era, none or little animal experiments were performed because people were not interested in physiology, therefore in animal experiments were not necessary because people were more interested in the afterlife than in the current life. So therefore we have to move to the age of the Renaissance for the history of animal experiments. So Andreas Vesalius was one of the first animal experimenters after the medieval era. He performed experimental comparison of human and animal physiology. Actually, he wasn't the first, it was also done in classical era, but as said, he was the first after the medieval era to do this. And in the Enlightenment, another prominent animal experimenter was William Harvey, who disproved Galenic principles by vivisection and dissection of animals. And he also was the first in Europe to discover blood circulation, though that was known 16 centuries prior in China. And he also discovered the correct function of the pumping function of the heart. So also note that the Galenic principles were in state for 14 centuries in total. So reasonings in the age of the Enlightenment. So lots of philosophers in this age. So one of them being René Descartes, who proposed that animals should be considered as soulless machines. Therefore, animal experiments should be seen as non-criminals because you're just doing experiments on machines. Spinoza had a different view on the topic. He proposed that animals do have feelings, but they're still non-human, so we may use them as we like. And John Locke had another view on the topic, and he proposed that we should prevent animal cruelty in order to prevent human cruelty, because people who are cruel to animals might become cruel to animals, which should be avoided at all costs. Moving on to the 18th century. So in this era, some very important scientific fields were founded thanks to experiments performed on animals. Examples of these fields are pharmacology and embryology. But do note that in this era, as in previous eras, there is no or little direct benefit to human health from these animal experiments. So in this 18th century, what happened is a debate shift from the previous Enlightenment era. So from do animals have feelings as a main question to are animal experiments justifiable for the greater good? So fitting with this debate shift, in my opinion, or the view of Immanuel Kant, although usually seen as an enlightened philosopher, but the era of his living is actually 18th century, so it's a bit vague, but in my opinion, but okay. Anyways, he proposed that vivisectionist actions in animal experiments are indeed cruel, but they're justified for the good of humankind through medicine. Moving on to the early 19th century. So now, as a first, clinical issues were used as grounds for animal experiments instead of the search for scientific knowledge, which was previously used as grounds for animal experiments. And some prominent animal experimenters in this period were François Magedy and Claude Bernard, who performed many vivisections for medical and also academic, in other words, educational purposes, but they had no empathy whatsoever for animal sufferings during these experiments. And their reasoning was that it was better to conduct animal experiments more realistic than to do direct human experiments that are trying it first on animals. But their experiments were seen as so cruel that they really boosted the anti-vivisectionism movements, which were also apparent in the 17th and the 18th century and slowly increasing, but steep increase in the early 19th century thanks to due to these experiments. And actually much of these experiments were one cause for the first animal protection law and first animal experiment law, which came into effect in Great Britain in the 19th century. The late 19th century had the modern views on animal experiment debate in place. So what is the value or the benefit of these animal experiments? How tightly should they be regulated? Are they justifiable, the animal experiments? Should we abolish them? What about ethical and critical thinking of scientists with regard to animal experiments? So the complex debate, as it's known today, is in place already in the late 19th century. And one position illustrating this complexity is that of Charles Darwin. He was an evolutionary scientist, so he made a lot of travels and was known to be against anti-animal cruelty, but he was also, as a scientist, pro the progress of science. So that as an example. And the late 19th century also saw the dawn of anesthetics for pain relief, partially thanks to the experiments, ironically, by Claude Bernard in the early 19th century, who did a lot of experiments on curare, among others. And the late 19th century also saw, for the first time, more direct benefit of human health from animal experiments, for instance, in vaccines. And one example of these last 2 points is the position of Louis Pasteur, who performed many experimental animal infections, but he used for his studies in bacteria and vaccines in his later career, but he used anesthetics and also humane endpoints. So, for instance, he used chloroform as a terminalization of the animals instead of the bacteria terminally infecting or killing, which were seen as animals, which are seen as more gruesome. So moving on to the 20th century. So the early 20th century saw less support for anti-vivisectionism due to major scientific successes and medicinal successes. Early 20th century also saw a species change, so shift towards rodents for the usage in animal experiments. The late 20th century saw the dawn of animal rights groups and animal ethics. One philosopher, Tom Reagan, arguing that all conscious beings should have equal value, so you should sacrifice animals. He proposed that in 1983. Unfortunately, animal rights groups also sometimes became quite extremist, so they started performing violent actions sometimes, which was quite over the top and had negative effects. So replacement, reduction, and refinement. This was coined by William Russell and Rex Birch in the and was these replacement of animals in experiments by non-sentient material, reducing animals and refining their welfare. These principles were adopted past 1978, and Russell Birch proposed that humane science is the best science, and the free art principles led to the welfare perspective. So animals can be used if their interests are considered whenever possible, but human lives have greater value than animal lives. And today the free arts are used as a central legislative animal usage principle. Concluding, so here on the left, you can see a graph depicting the number of animal experiments, the classic peak and the rise of animal experiments in the Enlightenment and in the 19th and 20th century declined due to the free art principles. And on the right, you can see a graph showing the support for anti-animal abuse. So increase from non-existent before the 17th century, increasing from the 17th century on to the 19th century, the decrease and the increase of the 20th century. That was my presentation. Thanks for listening. Any questions?